If, like me, you think that consciousness is a fundamental property of the world, it's natural to think it attaches to a fundamental entity, the self. All the same, we've got direct evidence of consciousness. I take consciousness to be a datum. I don't take the self to be a datum. If I introspect, I immediately find states of consciousness. But as David Hume said, I don't immediately find a self. So the inference to the self to me is more kind of a bit of theory, or at least optional. So it's attractive, if you see consciousness as fundamental, to think there might be a fundamental self.
So, what is the self? Let's tackle this question in the only way we have at hand, which is historically. Modernity's beginnings consisted in the first bourgeois intersubjective social relations replacing feudal ones, namely those established between lord and serf. Bourgeois, at its core, means that loyalty to your lord or king, who in his turn has to be loyal to the Pope, just as the Pope is God's serf, etc., is no longer how you want to do things. Bourgeois is to be loyal to yourself. Yes, that makes sense in bourgeois social relations. Bourgeois is to be self-standing, self-promoting, self-managing, in the sense that one, for example, no longer is a peasant and becomes a Frenchman who freely makes a living out of working the land. It means that a person is no longer noble, but becomes a person of merit. And there are many degrees of merit, we won't get into that. In this sense, the journey of what we call the self starts from the Renaissance all the way to today's postmodern identities, consciousness, and simulation theory. The free subject is the notion here, which is key. This notion has had many faces, all of which have in common the radically historical fact of having displayed the ideological symptoms of the specific needs of both individuals and collectives, it doesn't matter, in the struggle to make the mercantile system work as dominant, despite its contradictory or exploitative nature. That is, the different ideological conjunctures that have taken place in order to legitimize the different kinds of intersubjective social relations that each stage of the secular world demanded throughout modern history. But again, at first, this just meant getting rid of that non-subjective type of individual, which is either a lord or a serf, both of which just played by the book. By the divine book, that is. The idea that neither you as an individual nor your take on the world matter at all, but as an instance of your place in the world. There's no place for the self in a world that needs individuals to be attached to the land and to their natural lords. In this sense, the feudal was a specific relation of interpellation which precluded not only free economic and political association, but one where subjectivity, the consideration of one's own voice as an expressive or meaningful entity, and by the way, this is paramount for us to even be thinking about something as universal as literature, was just not there at all. It was the humanists living in those Italian independent cities of the 1300s, whose rich merchants they glorified with all that unearthing of classical references, that saw it fit for a man's use of language to carry or communicate the self to another self, in an act of sympathy, that is. They were new men for whom merit was about publicly exposing self-reflection, and despite all the mythical symbolism and anxiety of imitation, this was about laying bare the inner truth. On the other hand, politics was also starting to be predicated on this literal outlook into the world, hence Machiavelli's The Prince. In other words, the public level was now free subjectivity's counterpart. This meant a mortal wound for the rule of allegorical and organicist discourse. It was just hard facts of self-political management, whether a king or a courtier or a rascal, since all of those would now have private lives, Private lives that, for example, Shakespeare would use in his plots, and in the case of monarchy, he would be creating the human by doing so, in Harold Bloom's terms, 3 centuries later, that is. Indeed, this sense of direct communication between equals in merit finds its way first in Petrarch's notion of beautiful souls, individuals whose sensibilities are akin to those who could also see through the eyes of the other and could look out into the world, literally, that is, and not see an imperfect reflection of the divine world or the divine book, but a world that is neither good nor bad because it just awaits there to be recognized as both a microcosm for man's own inner stage of consciousness experiences, if you like, and a reality check for that which man gave himself from the day he adopted this literal outlook into the world, from the day he started producing the idea of secular knowledge or science, but also history, philosophy, literature, art, since all of those mean something completely alien to anything that was said and done prior to this increasingly mercantile-oriented society. It's only then, historically speaking, that we have a self to interrogate. It's only when intersubjective social relations become the norm that we find the conditions of possibility to even have this discussion about the self and the hard problem of consciousness. Just as any one of those different configurations of the free subject, whether Chomsky's subject, which is endowed with universal grammar and creativity, or on the contrary, Skinner's subject, whose freedom is predicated on the subject being aware of his or her own radically behavioral nature. The ideological demands of capitalism are about coming to terms with both mechanical production and the thirst for individual meaning that is ever slipping away. So, just as the Cartesian subject and its stripping down of the existence of the self to having the primordial doubt of existence, or Locke's memory, reason or understanding, and will as the secular 3 faculties of the soul, we also get Hume's version of the free self, the free subject, that is a subject that, as David Chalmers reminds us in that little clip we saw earlier, consists in a series of states of consciousness, which is just a way of saying that the self has this strictly experiential nature, a subject that is just thrown into this literal world of encounters with the substance of both physical and social reality, and just starts constructing itself through all those impressions that the world of phenomena provides for it, just as a character in a novel who finds the world around him as fit or unfit to his self-image, but nonetheless is transformed by making its course through life and building upon experience in itself. So we are never just closer to the truth of what the self is. We are just in ideology's next way of dealing with our new ways of exploiting each other. Certainly, we're not closer to truth just because we finally asked the right questions. We just carry on pushing the presuppositions that underpin the questions in the first place to allow us to phrase a more meaningful picture of ourselves and the system we nonetheless have to reproduce. My contention is that this meaningfulness rests on the fact that it is a legitimate question that we're asking. And it is legitimate because tossing answers around, whether clever or not, is a way of talking about our social relations without mentioning their exploitative nature. Not a false consciousness, but something that otherwise we can't just take at face value. The value of capitalist intersubjective social relations of exploitation.